A family in Germany sat down at their kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday morning and opened an envelope that changed everything they thought they knew about their financial future. The bill was not from a bank, not from a lender, not from anyone they had ever borrowed money from. It was their energy bill, and it had tripled overnight because of a war they had no part in. This was not an isolated incident. Across Europe, millions of households received the same shock, the same numbers, the same silence around the dinner table. If you want to understand how a war between two nations reached into the homes of ordinary families around the world, subscribe and stay with us. Because this story is only just beginning. When the conflict between Russia and Ukraine began escalating in early 2022, most people around the world watched from a distance. Through screens, through headlines, through numbers that felt abstract and far away. But within weeks, something shifted. The distance began to close. Not through news reports, not through political speeches, but through something far more personal. Through electricity bills, through heating costs, through the price of a loaf of bread at the grocery store on a Wednesday afternoon. Europe had spent decades building one of the most sophisticated energy systems in the modern world. Natural gas pipelines stretched across thousands of miles of land, connecting suppliers in the east to consumers in the west. For years, this system worked with remarkable efficiency. Homes stayed warm, factories kept running, economies expanded, and at the center of this system, quietly and consistently, sat one dominant supplier, Russia, providing roughly 40% of all the natural gas that European households and industries relied upon every single day. That dependency had been debated by economists and policymakers for years. Some argued it created stability, others warned it created vulnerability. But for most European families, it was simply invisible. It was infrastructure. It was background noise. It was something that worked without requiring attention, until suddenly it did not work at all. When international sanctions began targeting the Russian economy in response to the conflict, and when Russia responded by restricting and eventually cutting off gas flows through key pipelines, the invisible became visible almost overnight. The energy markets, which had already been under pressure from global supply disruptions following the economic recovery from the pandemic years, reacted with extraordinary speed. Natural gas prices in Europe surged to levels that analysts described as historically unprecedented. In some markets, prices increased by more than 300% within a matter of months. For ordinary households, this translated into something deeply concrete. A family in the Netherlands that had been paying roughly 150 euros per month for heating and electricity found themselves facing bills of 400, 500, sometimes 600 euros or more. In the United Kingdom, the energy price cap, a regulatory mechanism designed to protect consumers from extreme market volatility, was raised multiple times in a single year, pushing millions of households into what economists formally classify as fuel poverty. According to data published by the International Energy Agency, an intergovernmental organization that monitors global energy markets, more than 80 million people across Europe faced difficulty affording adequate energy during the winter months of 2023. But the financial pressure did not stop at the electricity meter. Energy is not simply a utility. It is an input into virtually every product and service in a modern economy. When the cost of energy rises, the cost of manufacturing rises, the cost of transportation rises, the cost of food production rises. Fertilizer, which is produced using natural gas as a primary input, became dramatically more expensive. Farmers across Europe, from the wheat fields of France to the grain operations of Poland, faced input costs that their business models had never been designed to absorb. Some reduced their planted acreage. Some exited the market entirely. The agricultural disruption that followed was not dramatic in the way that conflict is dramatic. It was quiet, gradual, and deeply consequential. The food price increases that followed were felt far beyond Europe. Ukraine and Russia together had historically accounted for a combined share of roughly 30% of global wheat exports and significant portions of sunflower oil and corn. When the conflict disrupted planting seasons, blocked port operations along the Black Sea, and introduced profound uncertainty into supply chains that the global food system had come to depend upon, the consequences rippled outward to regions that had no direct connection to the conflict whatsoever. In parts of North Africa and the Middle East, countries that imported the majority of their grain from the affected region faced sharp price increases at a time when their domestic economies were already under significant strain. The World Food Program, a United Nations agency responsible for addressing global food insecurity, reported that the number of people facing acute food insecurity worldwide increased substantially in the period following the escalation of the conflict. Meanwhile, governments across Europe found themselves in a position that their fiscal frameworks had not anticipated. The choice was stark: allow energy prices to reach their market levels and risk widespread economic hardship across the population, or intervene with subsidies, price caps, and emergency support programs that would place extraordinary pressure on public finances. Most governments chose intervention. Germany announced support packages worth hundreds of billions of euros. France extended its existing price cap mechanisms at enormous cost to the state treasury. The United Kingdom introduced an energy price guarantee scheme that analysts estimated would cost taxpayers tens of billions of pounds over its duration. These measures were necessary. They were also expensive in ways that will take years to fully account for. The corporate sector was not insulated from these pressures either. European industries that relied heavily on energy, steel production, chemical manufacturing, glass and ceramics, aluminum smelting, found themselves operating in an environment where their fundamental cost assumptions had been invalid. Several major industrial facilities reduced output or suspended operations entirely during periods of peak energy prices. Some companies began evaluating the long-term viability of maintaining energy-intensive production in Europe at all. The question of industrial competitiveness, which had been a background concern for European policymakers for years, moved suddenly and forcefully to the front of the agenda. The financial markets responded to all of this in ways that reflected the depth of the uncertainty. The euro weakened against the dollar significantly during 2022, at one point reaching parity, meaning €1 purchased $1. For the first time in approximately 20 years, European stock markets experienced significant volatility. The bond markets of several European governments came under pressure as investors assessed the fiscal implications of emergency energy support programs. Central banks, already navigating the challenge of rising inflation from pandemic-era monetary policy, found themselves confronting an additional inflationary impulse that originated not from domestic economic conditions, but from a geopolitical conflict thousands of miles from their monetary jurisdictions. The European Central Bank, which sets monetary policy for the countries that use the euro as their currency, raised interest rates multiple times in an effort to contain inflation. Each rate increase, however, also increased the cost of borrowing for households with variable rate mortgages, for small businesses dependent on credit, and for governments rolling over their existing debt. The interconnection of these pressures, energy prices feeding into general inflation, inflation driving monetary tightening adding financial stress to households and businesses already struggling with higher costs, created a feedback loop that economists described as one of the most complex macroeconomic environments in recent European history. What the data revealed when examined in full was something that many people had understood intuitively, but had perhaps never seen quantified so clearly: that in a globally integrated economy, the financial consequences of a major conflict do not remain contained within the borders of the countries directly involved. They travel through energy markets, through food supply chains, through currency exchange rates, through interest rate decisions, through government budget calculations, and ultimately through the monthly expenses of families who had never heard of the pipelines, or the ports, or the financial instruments through which their daily lives had become connected to events unfolding far from their own front doors. The numbers that economists use to describe these events, the percentage changes in energy prices, the billions allocated to subsidy programs, the basis points of interest rate increases, can make it easy to lose sight of what those numbers actually represent. They represent a pensioner in Belgium who turned her thermostat down and wore a second sweater through the winter. They represent a bakery owner in Spain who calculated, with genuine uncertainty, whether the cost of running his ovens would allow his business to survive another month. They represent a single parent in Poland who looked at a grocery receipt and made choices about which items to put back. The financial damage of this conflict was not abstract. It was specific, personal, and spread across a continent and beyond in ways that are still being measured and will continue to be felt for years to come. According to analysis published by the International Monetary Fund, the economic costs associated with the energy disruption alone ran into the trillions of dollars when measured across the full scope of affected economies. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of how interconnected the global economy truly is, and how the financial consequences of distant events can find their way into the most ordinary moments of everyday life, then this channel is built for exactly that kind of understanding. We will keep going deeper, keep following the money, and keep examining the financial stories that shape the world most people never see coming. Subscribe now, and make sure you do not miss what comes next, because the story we just told you is only one chapter of a much larger book that is still being written.